So, hey everyone, we're back. We did our first debate session yesterday at 11 a.m. with myself and Haseeb. And the context of that was we were debating the claim around whether Bitcoin can be more than a store of value. And he argued against that. And he fundamentally believes that Bitcoin will just be a store of value and nothing more. And I kind of disagreed. So we laid out our arguments yesterday. And then there was some feedback from the community that there were counter arguments that we didn't talk about that should be laid out as well, so that both sides are presented more fairly. So we decided to have a second session today, part 2, where Dan Hedl will walk us through some of his points that he felt like were missing from the debate yesterday. And I just want to summarize what we did talk about yesterday, and so that people who haven't had a chance to see that yet can also kind of catch up on it. Overall, again, the claim that we were arguing about was, is Bitcoin going to be more than a store of value? And I fundamentally just didn't believe that's the right way to even look at it. I just didn't even believe that you can separate the utility use case from the store of value use case. I just think that for Bitcoin to have to be a good store of value, it needs utility. And I also felt like it's too early to discredit all the use cases that Bitcoin was originally invented for, which is like a peer-to-peer cash system. We're only 6 years, less than 10 years into this vision, and I think it's too early to rule those out. And then Haseeb made the argument that he doesn't buy into the utility use case because he felt that the ethos around Bitcoin Core is to treat Bitcoin like digital gold. And he explained that there's a few reasons for this. For one, he felt like that a deflationary currency doesn't inherently make for a good currency, because people are more inclined to hoard it and not spend it. And so because Bitcoin is deflationary, he argues that people are going to be more incentivized to hoard it and not spend it like a currency. And he brought up this concept of Gresham's law, where good currencies drive out bad currencies, and it's unlikely that a deflationary currency, which I guess you're implying is good currency, will be used for currency instead of an inflationary currency, which is a bad currency. And then finally, he went on to argue that, I think this is maybe where Dan might have disagreed. He argued that Bitcoin is unlikely to be a good use case for payments because of its 7 transactions per second bottleneck. And I don't think he was suggesting that it can't go any higher, but rather that the Bitcoin Core's ideology is committed to keeping this system stable, and they haven't really shown indications of wanting to change that. And so because of that, he felt like we were treating it like digital gold and not a payment system. And he felt like a payment system needs to be able to do much more than just move Bitcoins around, which is not necessarily possible with Bitcoin today. And he's not saying that Bitcoin can't incorporate these use cases, but that the Bitcoin core has been opposed to these kinds of radical transformations on layer 1 to make these use cases possible. And instead, he argued that Bitcoin seems to want a more stable system that can be more used as a store of value, and so is treated like digital gold. And so that's kind of where we ended the debate yesterday. And then Dan had some really good feedback about things that we left out. So I'm going to hand the conversation over to Dan so that we can talk about this more. But before that, I just want to set the context that the point of this, again, is really not to say I'm right or Haseeb is wrong, or that Dan's right or Dan's wrong. It's really just to understand both sides of the argument and present both sides of the argument in a fair way, and let you, the audience, decide for yourself what you want to believe. And so there's let's keep our identity out of this, and let's just confront the issue and not the people itself, and keep everything constructive. So with that, Dan, I'll hand it off to you and kind of give the audience of why you disagreed with Haseeb in that argument.
And thanks for having me, Preeti, and also appreciate you having the guidelines that you brought up. I'd like to keep this kind of open, civil, and kind of to the point of just showing my perspective, and people can take that perspective and look at all the other ones that have been presented and then decide from there. So yeah, I want to start with the idea that Bitcoin was meant for payments, that Bitcoin was meant to be a cheap PayPal. So let's start there. And I actually wrote a tweet storm on it around, that Bitcoin's original purpose, I believe, is a store of value. And it provided a 47 tweet storm to provide some context as to why I believe that. And then here's a couple easy kind of quick hits to really touch on this. One is that his first message on the Bitcoin blockchain isn't Visa on the verge of raising processing fees. It's about central banks. And in Satoshi's first message after the white paper, in his first message on the P2P Foundation forum, in his first message, he goes, in this sense, he goes, the root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. The central bank must be trusted not to debase the currency, but the history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. So, right off the bat, we're seeing language that indicates that he has a huge issue with central banks, not Visa or merchant processors. In addition to that, 21 million hard cap, 10 megabyte blocks are not referenced in the white paper. Satoshi explicitly says, I first coded it up to see if I could make it work, and then I wrote the white paper. A lot of Satoshi's brilliance, I think, is in his go-to-market strategy. By the way, I'm using he as his pronoun.
Yeah.
Because he self-identified as him in his P2P Foundation profile. And so I think, we can look at the white paper and cherry pick sentences that are around payments, but we should look at it holistically, like the timing, the other language he used, the construction of the protocol. And if we look at, on his content that he creates, in his P2P Foundation profile, and the rest of what he writes, he's kind of crafting this content for the cypherpunks. He's trying to get them involved, trying to get them excited. Mm-hmm. And so, I think all of that we should take all of that into consideration.
So you're suggesting that even though it was named peer-to-peer cash system, he wasn't really going after the Visa use case, but he was going more after he's trying to fight the central bank.
Yeah, and I think the word cash, by the way, in a cypherpunk context means final, not cash in your pocket. It means it's a one-way, non-reversible transaction. Okay.
So less of a currency, like you pay cash to do this, but more like here's your wealth or store of value, I guess.
Yeah, well, the way to think about it is Satoshi's like a product manager, right? And he's developed this new product or this new currency, and he has to get people to use it. And so Satoshi references, he goes, the 21 million hard cap, a disinflationary currency model in terms of monetary policy, he does it for two reasons, and he talks about this. One is that there's no supply response as demand increases. Bitcoin's supply schedule is always going to print is going to print a very specific amount of Bitcoin no matter how much demand is there. And what that means is that when demand increases, as people buy Bitcoin and tell their friends about it, the price goes up because there is no supply response. There's no more printing. There's not an accelerated printing of Bitcoin that happens. And what that does is adherents come in and people come in as speculators. And so they kind of come in for the degenerate trading. And then when it collapses, only the people that truly believe stay. So the 21 million hard cap plays a very, very important part as the viral loop strategy. Essentially, it's a viral loop built into the core protocol, which is really brilliant. And then second, Satoshi goes, and I think he's joking, but I'm largely extrapolating here, that I would have chosen an inflation rate, but I don't know a way that we can trust third parties to pull in data externally and pipe that into the blockchain. And so, I've been an Austrian School of Economics sort of guy for a long time, very big libertarian. Mm-hmm. And Satoshi's right, because there is no way to calculate a proper rate of inflation. It's really a data problem. And so that's why Bitcoin has a disinflationary monetary policy to bootstrap the system and to kind of remove any humans from the decision-making process of choosing the proper rate of inflation.
Interesting. So how does that go? How is that different from what Haseeb was arguing?
Let me pull up my notes. That's kind of tough. Let's see. I think Haseeb essentially said that deflationary monetary policies, I believe he said that those actively kind of, if you're the asset that you hold, you expect it to appreciate in value, you won't spend it. And that therefore there's deflationary spirals where I believe he used the word deflationary spiral, which is that in a deflationary environment, as the price of goods drop, consumers withhold spending in the anticipation that prices will continue to drop, and that's why Bitcoin, as a its monetary policy of disinflation and eventually becoming deflationary, will inevitably mean that it will never be a good medium of exchange. And so I disagree with that point, and I wanted to bring up the reasons why Satoshi chose a disinflationary or eventually a deflationary monetary policy, because I wanted to make sure I touched on those, but more so to kind of counter the idea that a deflationary monetary policy makes spending impossible. As we've seen with electronics, people don't withhold spending forever. Even though my TVs continue to get larger and cheaper, I'm not going to withhold spending on a TV for forever. Eventually, I will make that purchasing decision. And so we've seen empirically that even though consumers can rely on electronics prices to drop, they will just like with any other service. I could try to withhold spending on food, but eventually my body will need it.
Yeah. So you're saying like it might lead to some hoarding, but eventually they'll want to spend it.
Of course, yes. And as you know, I think the biggest problem around spending Bitcoin is largely the intra-day volatility.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how cheap the fees are or how fast it is. That is still a giant user experience hurdle. And I think in the crypto space, a lot of times we take off that user experience hat and just hope people will like our technology because it's decentralized. But I like to be customer obsessed and be really focused on that user experience. And I think, I really want, I know Lightning will unlock some use cases because it makes things cheaper and faster. However, it will not solve the intraday volatility problem. And that's where Bitcoin's better as a speculative store of value right now. As its market capitalization increases over time, if it is successful as a new world reserve currency and its price becomes stable, then it moves into the medium of exchange or unit of account utility. Not to say that it's mutually exclusive right now. It's best used as that for most people. But you're free to use it as you see fit.
And so do you think, do you envision that it will be used in that way? Do you agree with Haseeb in the sense that it's a possibility that Bitcoin just stays a store of value, a good store of value beyond what it is right now, which is more of a speculative store of value, but hopefully over time it becomes a really good store of value and it just doesn't become any more than that? Or do you envision that things like Lightning will make this beyond that and actually something useful that you use day to day?
Well, I would push back on the idea that store of value isn't useful. Okay. We have an immutable, very hard to seize way to store value digitally in Bitcoin, and that's an amazing feat. The fact that I could put $1 billion in my Trezor and then send it to anyone in the world without having to ask for permission is incredible. And so I don't think we should downplay that as lacking utility. A lot of times when we look at currency, we look at it through the lens of how we've used our fiat currency, which is largely a medium of exchange and unit of account. So it's totally intuitive that we would then subjectively look at Bitcoin and say, hey, why isn't it performing like it would with my traditional fiat currency? That's because Bitcoin is more analogous to gold 2.0, which doesn't reduce its ability to be a medium of exchange. It simply means at this stage in its evolution as a currency, it is best used as a store of value due to that intraday volatility.
And so what do you think would, can you reiterate, what do you think makes Bitcoin a good store of value? I think we can argue that the reason gold is a good store of value is because humans have intrinsically valued it for centuries, whether it's for jewelry or collectibles or some minimal industrial use cases. And so I'm willing to store my value in gold again, because I know I'm almost guaranteed that if I go sell that gold to someone, they're going to want it on the other end. What do you think what argument do you have for Bitcoin being a good store of value?
Yeah, so that's called the utility theory of money, right? That the money has to have an inherent utility.
Yeah.
But gold's utility is largely in its use as a store of value. Yeah, sure, there is some small industrial use for gold. However, jewelry, you only wear it because it is valuable. For example, there's a lot of other shinier metals that are cheaper. So if gold's utility was in its shininess, which some might claim, you could also use that argument with other cheaper metals. So largely gold's value is driven by it's people's want to store value in it. Now, what makes it good money? You can think about money as being like an organism, and that organism has certain genetic code that surfaces itself in traits, and those traits are like divisibility, immutability, fungibility, all these parameters that make a good money.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bitcoin is a good store of value because its parameters or its traits as a money are more advantageous than fiat and gold. Now, you're right, though. The one thing it does lack is its historical trust or the historical significance of it as a store of value. And the only way that's going to change is time.
Yeah.
And hence why I think it's kind of a fun speculative investment, is because if other people believe the same thing that I believe, then we should be if you hold Bitcoin, you'll be financially rewarded for that.
Yeah. No, I think Haseeb would agree with that point, in the sense that I think he agrees that Bitcoin could be a good store of value for all the reasons that you just stated. I think like his where I think you might be diverging is that he just thinks that the core has been so resistant to make it anything more than digital gold. And so he's kind of dismissing that use case beyond just hoarding it for store of value. And I think you're making the argument that no, that's the case now, but that will likely change. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm saying that this changes over time, and that like the core. So he used Bitcoin Core in a weird way. Part was a little bit derogatory. Using saying Bitcoin Core around the core like coding is fine. But he kind of referenced Bitcoin Core in terms of the currency, which Bitcoiners don't reference Bitcoin as Bitcoin Core. To be clear, Bitcoin Core is like the repo, not necessarily the currency. The currency is called Bitcoin. And so I felt like Haseeb was, and by the way, really respect Haseeb. I think he's really, really sharp guy. I've read a bunch of his Medium articles, so really like Haseeb. I do feel like it was a little bit off the mark and a little bit disingenuous not to provide context as to why the Bitcoin Core developers made those decisions. He kind of just made it sound like they were Luddites, that Bitcoin Core is just like this frustratingly slow and inept or incompetent group of developers. And I feel like that's disingenuous, because in life, there's always trade-offs.
Yeah.
What trade-offs did those core developers make is the most important question. And then we can, it's subjective as to if that was the right decision or not. I would personally believe it was the right decision. But essentially, the Bitcoin core development team, they're looking at Bitcoin from a nuclear grade resistant sort of perspective. Like, how do we have this survive? The internet getting partitioned, and that's why Bitcoiners like Bitcoin satellites and propagating Bitcoin blocks and transactions over radio. Because if the internet ever got partitioned, which isn't a non-zero chance, how does Bitcoin survive? So Bitcoin's core development philosophy, Bitcoin Core and the core developers, their philosophy is around that. So when it comes to trade-offs, a lot of the businesses in crypto wanted Bitcoin to raise the block size. So that was the whole debate in 2015 to 2017, which culminated in the Bcash hard fork. And so I think, when you look at it and the decisions that they made, they go, what is the number one trait of this currency that is valuable? And it's in the immutability of the currency. And so anything that centralizes the currency in terms of like, if we raise the block size, then there would be less nodes, in which Bitcoiners are very much about people running their own nodes so they can directly plug into the blockchain and not have to trust anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Bitcoin core development team said no to the crypto businesses for two reasons. One, it would centralize the running of nodes, and two, if they bend on that request for crypto businesses, then what's the next one going to be? Is it going to be around like the block reward, and maybe we should have a tail emission, and a bunch of businesses get together and go, hey, we want this? And so it's a slippery slope if you do say yes to a request like that. And then finally, Bitcoin's development is focused on scalability that is in layers, layer 1, layer 2, rather than all the scaling happening on layer 1. And I think that's a wise, mature product philosophy and design architecture. Mm-hmm. As the innovation can be pushed to layer 2, and the layer 1 can kind of become just very, very hyper efficient, like with Schnorr signatures, masked, graft root, taproot. And layer 2 is where like the net value of a lightning channel can then print on layer 1.
Yeah, so I think like, okay, so yeah, from my understanding, I think you're right. Like Haseeb did say that ideologically, Bitcoin is committed to keeping the system stable and has shown indications of being resistant to change. And I think to your argument, they're doing that for good reason, because they want to protect the currency. They don't want to make sacrifices, short-term sacrifices, and potentially risk making it not even a good store of value in the first place, which is what we're trying to get to. And I think what you're saying is he made like the point he forgot to give the context of why that is.
Yeah, he's not necessarily wrong. It just doesn't provide the whole context, and it could lead you to believe that the Bitcoin core development team is like grossly incompetent and that they're a bunch of Luddites, which I don't think is incites them. So
yeah, and I think like I fundamentally think it's more of a communication problem than anything else, because I think sometimes if they're resistant to change, outsiders are making assumptions of why they might be resistant to change, and maybe one of the assumptions is they're like Luddites and they're dogmatic about it. But because there's not much communication happening between what's happening at core and why those decisions aren't being made, and then the outsiders. So like it's probably easy for outsiders to say, okay, like this might be the reason, without actually understanding the core philosophy. And sometimes that gets lost because there's so few people who are aware of what's actually happening on the inside that the outsiders kind of make these assumptions. Would you agree?
I agree, and I think it's also a part of like what mental models you use. In Silicon Valley, a lot of us use a very like tech-oriented mindset, and I think if you just use that, you can kind of jump to some of these conclusions. And if you don't act kind of more holistically and pull in mental models around like monetary policy and everything else, then those are kind of like additional color crayons, and you can color in the landscape, I think, with a little bit more granularity.
Yeah, and so kind of going back to the claim, like, would you say you agree or disagree with Haseeb in the sense that it can't be more than a store of value, or it can be more than a store of value?
I think coming from a user experience and kind of core design architecture of the protocol, it makes the most sense as a store of value now and for a decade or two. Now, medium of exchange is not mutually exclusive. People can use it for that. However, the use cases around medium of exchange will largely have to be meaningful enough that people are willing to jump through the user experience hurdles. For example, buying drugs on Silk Road. people are willing to jump through a lot of hurdles to buy drugs.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we should be empathetic towards the user. Like, I want them to buy into decentralized currencies, but decentralized like cryptocurrencies. But why should they use it to buy a cup of coffee? I mean, it's largely like I don't even get my credit card points, right?
Yeah.
And look, in my pure libertarian utopia world, I'd love that. But we're not in that right now, and we should be empathetic.
And how far do you think we are from that? And what are the things happening in the ecosystem now to make that possible?
Yeah, I think back to a point that you made around, I think you were talking about like maybe this wasn't you, but talking about what stage are we at, or like how long is this going to take, or that time is an important part as a store of value, that people have trusted it for a long period of time.
Yeah.
This is a generational thing. I mean, we're largely the first. I'm 31, by the way. I was kind of the first analog to digital age cohort, and then the ones younger than myself, they're digitally native. And so with baby boomers, I think it's kind of hard for, I'm somewhat overly simplifying age groups, but this is a generational thing where as Bitcoin survives and continues to survive, and more people believe in it over time, it kind of slowly, captures market share and slowly captures mind share. But it's not going to be this nice, 5-year, 10-year path. It's going to be decades. And so I think medium of exchange makes more sense decades later as the market cap becomes larger and the price becomes more stable.
Yeah. No, and I think we're mostly aligned in how we think. I think I agree with you that currently Bitcoin, like, it just doesn't make sense to use Bitcoin as anything more than a store of value because the UX is so hard for a normal user compared to a credit card or cash,
Right.
at least in most countries. And but I think one thing that bothers me, and I think you're alluding to a little bit, is that like we shouldn't forget about the fact that there is this other use case that we should enable if it's possible. We shouldn't just like stop innovating here, and we should try to get to the bigger goal of like enabling a medium of exchange use case if possible. Would you agree?
I would agree, and that's largely what Lightning is.
Okay.
So Lightning, brings about speed, cost, and privacy. It brings improvements in all three of those to Bitcoin, which I think is magnificent. Yes, there are large user experience hurdles to cross with Lightning. I am not under any sort of, I'm not disillusioned enough to believe that like Lightning is going to be easy. However, Lightning is a path forward. There's a lot of people working on it.
Yeah.
These UX problems, I don't think are exponential. I think they're more linear. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that people can use Lightning. And even if Lightning isn't kind of unanimously used across all market participants, even if Lightning is used in just between certain parties, that would still be a huge improvement because each Lightning channel can have up to 400 transactions per second, if not more.
Yeah.
So we're not talking like 1,000, like 10,000 scaling improvement. We're talking about million X in scaling improvement. Depends on how many channels are open and how often those channels are used.
Yeah. Like, I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions because a few are coming in. One
Cool.
question they had, Dan, was, can a better coin come around and people choose that new coin instead of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And Hasu, a kind of a Twitter personality, he writes some really great Medium articles around how Bitcoin is both a technology and social, has both a technological and social component. So for a better currency to come around, it would have to have, genetic code that manifests itself via traits that give it a better, make it a better store of value in terms of they've better aligned incentives, like with proof of work, or they have a better monetary policy, which, I think a lot of people forget that Bitcoin wasn't the first cryptocurrency. You had like Hashcash, B-Money, BitGold. Those were currencies as organisms that died on the operating table. Their genetic code made them incapable of having life. And Bitcoin sort of Frankenstein that, where Satoshi cut snippets from those organisms, their genetic code, and put that together to make Bitcoin. So Bitcoin isn't the MySpace. Bitcoin is like the many other iterations down the line. And I think Bitcoin is one of the first currencies to get all the incentives right, which is really, really hard. So I think it's unlikely that a new coin would have the genetic code or the social shared belief in its value to overcome Bitcoin's network effect, which is very, very large.
That's a bold claim. We should have another session just about that.
Sounds good.
But there was another question that's good from someone. They said, what are the 3 biggest criticisms of Bitcoin that you have?
3 biggest, I think, look, a lot of Bitcoiners, we've had to kind of hostily defend our belief in Bitcoin from inception, from journalists, our friends and family, our coworkers, governments, economists, and so I think that's a good thing. Is Bitcoiners are typically like kind of hyper vigilant about being critical, but I do think it'd be nice if we could sometimes be a little bit take the time to explain things instead of just jumping to conclusions when someone kind of attacks Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's one.
Yeah.
2, let's see. I think this is a great question. 2, as a growth marketer and a growth product guy, like it would be cool if Bitcoin did have, if like the Bitcoin Foundation hadn't so horribly collapsed, or there was more money kind of spent on like general Bitcoin marketing. I think that would be really cool. It's actually incredibly surprising Bitcoin's gotten this far with no marketing team. and no like no marketing team, no outreach team. It's just kind of all peer to peer, right? And so that, I do kind of lament that there was never an organization put together that could be like funded by Coinbase and Binance and other companies to kind of help polish some of the narrative and maybe fight some of the FUD with like mainstream publications. That would have been kind of cool. But inherently with a decentralized system, that's what you get, right?
Yeah.
And then 3, I don't know, like I think Luke Dasher, one of the Bitcoin Core developers, he's really, really intelligent, and Luke's not wrong about some of the things that he's asking to do with like the Bitcoin block size, like reducing it. But I do think like there could be some better kind of more holistic thinking around, I think the core devs are pretty brilliant in terms of like how they've directed Bitcoin's progress so far. But like I think like some developers might be beneficial for them to zoom out a little bit and look at the context as to what they're asking for.
Got it. So your 3 criticisms, to reiterate: 1 is when there's conflict or just things that need to be discussed in a healthy way, you wish the community was a little bit more civil around that, I guess is the right way to put it. 2, maybe a Bitcoin Foundation that can help spread the message of what Bitcoin is trying to be. But that's hard to do in a decentralized setting. And then 3rd, what was the 3rd one? I think certain core developers sometimes don't. I used Luke as an example with reducing the block size. He's not technically wrong, but without any other consideration, he's not wrong. But when you look at other considerations, I think it's good to be holistic in sort of determining. We shouldn't be so laser focused on just optimizing for one thing. It should be more viewed in a holistic manner. Yeah. There's another question about Lightning. They said, what's your favorite Lightning network implementation as far as developer friendliness goes?
Well, the OpenNode guys are really awesome. They're sort of like a core developer tool that people can use when they go build Lightning laps. Like Lightning apps. So OpenNode guys are awesome. I just saw them in San Francisco 2 weeks ago.
Cool.
And then Tippin.me for an application.
I've actually, so that's been going around Twitter, huh?
Yeah, it's really been hitting the crypto Twitter.
Yeah, I keep getting a bunch of tips, and I'm like, what is going on? I gotta check it out. You just tip people on Twitter, I guess? Yeah,
it's kind of nice because it's a Chrome extension, so it has like a little lightning bolt alongside favoriting, commenting, and retweeting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a beta project, so use at your own risk, but it's kind of fun. And my background, I built ChangeTip back in the day. I was the first product manager at ChangeTip, and ChangeTip back in 2015. For those who don't know, we did micropayments over social media with Bitcoin. So for me, tipping is kind of an old love in terms of products that I've built before. So it kind of is nostalgic for me.
Yeah. And then there's another question for me, I guess. They said, what 3 things are you most bullish about for Bitcoin? It's kind of some similar things that Dan was bullish about, in the sense that I think Bitcoin has the Lindy effect going for it, in the sense that it was the first decentralized currency and people know about it. It's become like, it's so accustomed to people's belief system now that it's really hard I would argue it is kind of difficult for another coin to come along and compete in that way, just because of the Lindy effect. But who knows, right? Like maybe there'll be a really great currency that gets built and we'll all move to it. But the chances of that, I would say, are arguably low. So I'm bullish about that for Bitcoin. Just it has a time advantage that other currencies don't have. I am bullish about the fact that they are very careful about what changes go into the core protocol. And I think I align with Dan on this a little bit. I think they just have a different mentality of what they're trying to enable, at least today. And I don't think one is the right way to do it or another is the wrong way to do it. Like whether you choose to have a stable, decentralized system, or you want to enable more scalable applications, I don't think one is better than the other. But I think I do like the fact that they stick to their grounds and they're very committed to making this an amazing store of value. So I'm bullish about that. And even though sometimes it comes off as dogmatic, which I wish changed, I think that's just what Bitcoin is. And sometimes like you gravitate towards that because it has that ethos. Third thing I would say, I'm bullish about the fact that, like it's been around for how long it's been, and it has like it's starting to reach a point where like the price is like kind of stabilizing, and I'm bullish about the fact that it hasn't crashed. That's pretty awesome. Like who thought like even 4 years ago that this thing would exist? I remember joining Coinbase, and like when I first joined and I told my friends I was joining Coinbase, like literally none of my friends knew what Bitcoin or anything or Coinbase was. And so 2 years later, here we are, like, and we're like 10x the awareness of what this whole crypto thing is. And I think I'm very bullish about the fact that Bitcoin actually probably helped make that possible in a big way. So yeah, I think that's it. I will end the conversation here. We'll have more of these. The point again of these is not to say one person is right or one person is wrong, but I think we all have different points of view, and I want to make sure that like we can at least explore those ideas without being criticized or being called wrong, because I think there's merit to both sides, and I think it's important to present it. And that's kind of what we're doing at True Story. So we thought we'd bring some of these conversations to life. So thank you, Dan, for coming on, and I'll see you on Twitter, I guess.
Really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for having me.